Hello everyone. In this particular video we are going to explore different options to install CentOS on your computer. This is a video for beginners, I would like to say, or intermediates. But in this video we are not going to install anything. We are just going to have a look around the options that we have in which way we can install CentOS on a computer. Now, the architecture of operating system is like that it sits on the top of your hardware. So this is a hardware. Suppose hardware is nothing but just your CPU, RAM, and hard drive, and network, whatsoever hardware components you might have in your machine. And operating system is just a software which allows other applications to run on the top of hardware, and operating system itself manages the interaction of applications or softwares or programming languages with the hardware. So you can have Windows on the top of your hardware. Mostly in personal computing, I would like to say 90%, around 90%. It is just a wild guess, but around 90 to 95% people would be using Windows. Some would be using Mac OS, and very rarely 1 or 2% users would be using Linux on the top of their hardware. If a person, so you can use Windows, Mac OS, or Linux on the top of your hardware directly. You can install them on the top of your hardware, and similarly you can install CentOS on the top of your hardware. Now CentOS is just the type of Linux itself. I just wanted to elaborate it more because uh, there are other types of Linux as well. Ubuntu is one type of Linux, Debian, Fedora. So SUSE Linux is also there. So now we are squared back to Windows. Why we are squared back to Windows? Let's come back to this slide only. If we are going to install CentOS on the top of our hardware, we will have to format the Windows machine. Now you have formatted your Windows machine and you are installing CentOS. Suppose in the middle of installation there comes some error message, and you being a beginner cannot understand the error message and cannot troubleshoot it, then you will not be able to use CentOS or Windows. Your hardware will be empty and no operating system will be there for you to perform any future tasks for a particular moment of time until which you get your computer repaired. So this is not the option that I would like to suggest to beginners. CentOS, the beginners should not install CentOS on the top of hardware. Now we come back to Windows machine because we cannot install CentOS on the top of our hardware directly. What we can do now, we want dedicated resources for the machine. So what we can do now is that we can configure a dual boot on the top of our hardware, which will allow us to choose Windows or CentOS to boot with. If we use Windows, if we choose the Windows option, the computer will boot with Windows. It will load Microsoft Windows operating system, whichever version you are using, 8 or 10 or 7. 7 has been expired. If we choose CentOS, then it will boot with CentOS. Now again, Installing CentOS with a dual boot option is a tedious task. It is not recommended for beginners to perform this task until they get a good knowledge of the CentOS ecosystem. So again, this is not the option that we would like to go with, and we are squared back to Windows only. So now what we can do, we can use a hypervisor. Now what does a hypervisor do? um, Hypervisor divides your hardware into logical segments. Suppose you have 16 GB of RAM and 8 CPUs in your virtual machine. Oh, sorry, in your physical machine. This is called a physical machine. So because it has a physical hardware, so this is a physical machine, and you are using Windows, but you have some resources in spare, like out of your 8 virtual CPUs and 16 GB RAM, your Windows is only using let's say 2 CPUs and 4 GB of RAM. Then you have left with 6 CPUs and 12 sorry, 4, yeah, 12 gig of RAM. So what you can do is you can install a hypervisor. Oracle VirtualBox is one of the freewares in terms of hypervisor. Uh, so you can install a hypervisor. On hypervisor, you can create a virtual machine by allocating your hardware resources to it. And on the top of your virtual machine, you can install CentOS. Now, this virtual machine is virtual, you cannot see it, and we will discuss about virtual machine and hypervisor in a different video. But for now, you can just take it like this only, that on the Windows you can install hypervisor, and hypervisor can provide you a virtual machine on the top of which you can install your CentOS. In this particular case, Windows and CentOS will both be able to run simultaneously. You will be able to run them both simultaneously. Dedicated resources will not be there. The resources will be shared by the hypervisor. The hypervisor will manage the sharing of the resources between your Windows operating system, which is known as host operating system in this particular case, and CentOS operating system, which is known as the guest operating system in this particular case. So in this particular case, you will be able to use Windows and CentOS simultaneously. So this is the first way I would like to recommend a beginner to install and do all of this. But what if, Amar, we do not have, let's say, a lot of resources? We do not have a lot of resources. We have a limited amount of resources, and we cannot afford a hypervisor in our machine to create a virtual machine, which will again take some resources out of it. We want a lightweight uh, thing to do all this task. Then again, we are squared back to Windows. Now we will have an option in which you can use, but again, this depends upon your expertise how you can do it. No, now you are mentioning that you are a beginner in Linux, so you can use a Docker engine, and on the top of Docker engine you can create a container of CentOS, and you can use this containerized CentOS to uh, run a lightweight version of CentOS. The it will be CLI only. So CentOS will be CLI only, and if you want to learn CentOS, I would like to say, if you want to learn CentOS, learn it in the CLI mode only, rather than GUI mode. Be stick to the CLI mode, because CLI mode is the most used mode of CentOS. And if you are learning CentOS and if you want to use it for corporate environment, then definitely in 99.99% cases they will have it in CLI mode only. So I would like to recommend you to learn it in CLI mode only. So in this particular case, you will have a Windows operating system, you will have a Docker engine on the top of which you will have a CentOS container, and you will be able to run it. Now the problem with the good thing about the container is that it will not take up your resources. The bad thing is about the bad thing about this thing or this Docker engine is that you must be knowing a thing or two about Docker. You must know how to operate Docker before. You only need to know two commands. One is the Docker pull, and another is the Docker run. But again, on the top of Docker pull and Docker run, what will happen if you will use Docker pull? The Docker pull command will Docker pull CentOS command will give you the latest CentOS container image, the lightweight image that you need to run CentOS. And the docker run command will enable you to run the CentOS container, but you will need to know about the mounting part as well. If you want the data, if you do not want the data, you do not need to know the mounting part. If you want to do the networking in this containerized application, you will have to know about the Docker networking as well. And if you want to if you want to do the things here and there every now and then I will not suggest this particular type of structure to use, because this structure is volatile. The Docker containers can stop at the moment you exit them. The data in the containers will the moment you exit them and the moment you delete them to free up the memory, the data in the containers will go away. So again, a summary of the video. So first case, CentOS on the top of your hardware when you need dedicated resources to Linux, and when you are an intermediate at least. The second case in which you are using a dual boot is first when you need resources dedicated to Linux again, and when you are an intermediate at least. Now the third option is for beginners. Fair amount of resources you must have on your computer. You do not need any kind of experience of Docker. You need your data to be maintained, and this is for beginners. Fair amount of resources is needed. This can do in lesser amount of resources as well. Docker experience is optional. I can tell you 3 or 4 commands that will help you out, but especially this thing, no need of saved data. If you need saved data, I would recommend you to go with the option number 3. So that's all for now. Thank you everyone.